The first punch landed square in Harold Stewart's chest, sending the 92-year-old veteran stumbling backward into the brick wall of Murphy's bar. His worn army jacket scraped against the rough surface as he slid down, wincing. "Watch where you're going, old man," Tank Morrison bellowed, his leather vest straining against his beer gut. His Harley-Davidson still rocked slightly where Harold had accidentally brushed against it while walking past. A crowd of Friday night bargoers had spilled onto the sidewalk, drawn by the commotion. Cell phones emerged from pockets. Someone was already recording. But nobody moved to help. Harold raised his weathered hands, not in defense, but in apology. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the pain radiating through his ribs. "Didn't mean to touch your bike." Tank's second in command, Bobby, cracked his knuckles. "Doesn't matter what you meant, Grandpa. Damage is done." Harold slowly pushed himself up from the wall, his arthritis screaming in protest. Blood trickled from a split on his lower lip where it had hit the brick. Still, he kept his hands at his sides. The crowd watched in silence, waiting, recording. No one intervened. 30 minutes later, a Black Hawk helicopter landed outside the bar. Quick pause. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from. And if you're new to the channel, smash that subscribe button because tomorrow's story is going to absolutely blow your mind. Harold Stewart had been awake since 0430 hours, same as every morning for the past 70 years. Military habits died hard, especially when they were all you had left to structure your days around. He shuffled to his kitchen window, arthritis making each step deliberate and careful. Outside, Millbrook was still dark, streetlights casting long shadows down Main Street. The town had been dying slowly for 20 years, ever since the textile mill closed. Now it was mostly empty storefronts and a handful of businesses hanging on by their fingernails. His reflection stared back from the window, a gaunt face mapped with liver spots and wrinkles, thinning white hair combed with military precision. The man in the mirror looked every bit of his 92 years, but his gray eyes remained sharp and alert. Harold pulled on his jacket, the same army field jacket he'd worn for his morning walks since 1987. The fabric was faded olive drab now, soft from years of washing. 3 bronze star ribbons were pinned above the left breast pocket, though most people didn't know what they meant anymore. The walk to Rita's diner took him 20 minutes now. Used to take 8. His left leg dragged slightly, a souvenir from Heartbreak Ridge, where Chinese mortars had found his foxhole in the winter of '51. The doctors had wanted to amputate back then. Harold had refused. 64 years later, he still limped, but he walked. Rita looked up from the coffee pot when he entered, her face brightening. She was 63, a widow who'd inherited the diner from her parents. Next to his daughter Sarah, Rita was probably the only person in Millbrook who still talked to him regularly. "Morning, Harold." "The usual." "Yes, ma'am." "Thank you." She poured black coffee into a heavy ceramic mug and slid it across the counter. Harold wrapped his gnarled fingers around it, savoring the warmth. At his age, he felt cold most of the time, even in summer. "You eating today?" Rita asked, though she already knew the answer. Harold ordered the same thing every morning. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, no butter. He ate half and took the rest home for later. Fixed income didn't leave much room for restaurant meals. "Just coffee today, Rita." "Thank you." She nodded and didn't push. Rita understood dignity, understood that some people couldn't afford pride and breakfast both. Harold sat in his usual booth by the window, watching Millbrook wake up. A few early commuters grabbed coffee to go. The mailman made his rounds. Mrs. Patterson walked her ancient beagle past the diner, same as she had every morning for 15 years. Most people didn't really see Harold anymore. He'd become part of the background, like the worn linoleum or the perpetually broken jukebox in the corner. An old man who minded his own business and bothered no one. They didn't know he'd carried wounded soldiers through frozen Korean hills while Chinese bullets whined overhead. They didn't know he'd earned 3 bronze stars before his 22nd birthday. They didn't know he'd raised a daughter who became one of the finest helicopter pilots in the United States Army. Harold finished his coffee and left exact change on the table, plus $1 tip. Rita always protested, but he insisted. A man paid his debts, even small ones. The walk home took him past Murphy's Bar, a dive that catered to Millbrook's rougher element. Even at 10 in the morning, a few motorcycles were parked outside. Harold had never set foot in the place, but he'd heard the stories. Fights, drugs, trouble. The kind of establishment that attracted the kind of people who'd left town years ago, then drifted back with nothing to show for their time away except scars and bad attitudes. Harold's house sat on Elm Street, a modest 2-bedroom ranch that had once been painted yellow. Now it was more of a tired beige, with a front porch that sagged slightly and gutters that needed cleaning. He'd bought it in 1953 with his GI Bill benefits, back when he thought he'd fill it with children and grandchildren. Life had other plans. Inside, the house was clean but sparse. Harold kept military order. Bed made with hospital corners, dishes washed and put away, everything in its place. Framed photographs lined the mantel above the fireplace. His wife Margaret, dead now 15 years. His daughter Sarah in her dress blues at West Point graduation. His old unit from Korea, most of those boys long buried. The phone rang twice all morning. Once was a telemarketer. The second was Sarah, calling from Fort Campbell. "Hi, Dad. Just checking in." "I'm fine, sweetheart. How are you?" "Busy. We've got exercises running all week. But I wanted to hear your voice." Harold smiled. Even as a full colonel commanding a helicopter squadron, Sarah still worried about her old man. "I had coffee with Rita this morning. Walked to the diner and back." "Good. You need to keep moving." A pause. "Dad, I've been thinking. Maybe it's time you considered assisted living. There are some nice places near base where—" "I'm fine here, Sarah. This is home." Another pause. Sarah had inherited her father's stubborn streak. "We'll talk about it when I visit next month." Looking forward to it. After she hung up, Harold sat in his recliner and tried to read, but his eyes weren't what they used to be. The words blurred together after a few minutes. Instead, he dozed fitfully, dreaming of snow-covered mountains and the faces of friends who'd never made it home. By 5 o'clock, the summer heat had begun to break. Harold decided to walk to the library before it closed, return a book of Korean War memoirs he'd been struggling to finish. The words hit too close to home sometimes. Main Street was busier now, people getting off work, some heading home, others settling in for Friday night drinks. Murphy's Bar was already crowded. Motorcycles lined up outside like mechanical stallions. Music and laughter spilled through the open door. Harold walked slowly, favoring his good leg. The library was only 4 blocks away, but he'd learned to pace himself. He stayed on the opposite side of the street from Murphy's, not out of fear, but out of practicality. No point looking for trouble. He was crossing at the corner when it happened. A kid on a skateboard shot past him, moving too fast, too close. Harold instinctively stepped sideways to avoid collision and stumbled slightly, his left hand shooting out to steady himself. His palm landed on the seat of a gleaming Harley-Davidson. "Hey!" The shout came from behind him. Harold turned to see a mountain of a man in leather and denim striding toward him. Tank Morrison stood 6'4" and weighed close to 300 pounds, most of it muscle gone soft around the edges. His arms were covered in tattoos, skulls, eagles, naked women, and a faded Marine Corps emblem on his left bicep. "You just touched my bike, old man." Harold removed his hand immediately. "I'm sorry." Kid on a skateboard had to step out of the way. Didn't mean any harm. Tank's crew had emerged from the bar. Bobby, Diesel, and a few others whose names Harold didn't know. They formed a loose semicircle, blocking his path to the sidewalk. Other bar patrons followed, drawn by the promise of confrontation. "Doesn't matter what you meant," Tank said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being the biggest, meanest thing in any room. "That's a $40,000 machine. Custom paint job. Nobody touches her without permission." Harold raised his hands slightly, palms out. "I understand. I apologize. Won't happen again." The crowd was growing. People with phones recording everything. Harold could see his reflection in the camera lenses. A frail old man in a faded army jacket, surrounded by leather-clad bikers. Perfect viral video material. Tank stepped closer. "You know what I think, Grandpa? I think you don't show proper respect. Think you can just shuffle around town doing whatever you want because you're old." "I don't want any trouble," Harold said quietly. Too late for that. Tank's eyes were bloodshot, his breath heavy with alcohol. "You disrespected my property. In front of my crew. That requires— what's the word? Restitution." Bobby cracked his knuckles. "Want me to handle this, Tank?" Tank held up a hand. "Nah. I got this." He looked Harold up and down, taking in the thin frame, the careful way he stood, the obvious physical fragility. "Tell you what, old man. You get down on your knees, apologize proper, and we'll call it even." The crowd murmured. A few people looked uncomfortable, but nobody spoke up. Harold felt the weight of their stares, the cameras recording his humiliation. "I've already apologized," Harold said. "I'm sorry about your motorcycle. But I won't get on my knees." Tank's face darkened. "No. No." The punch came fast, a straight shot to Harold's chest that sent him stumbling backward. His shoulder hit the brick wall of Murphy's bar with a wet thud. Pain exploded through his ribs, the same ribs that had been cracked by North Korean rifle butts in 1951. Harold slid down the wall, his legs giving out. But he didn't cry out, didn't beg, didn't raise his hands to defend himself. He just looked up at Tank with those steady gray eyes and waited. "Get up," Tank commanded. Harold struggled to his feet, using the wall for support. Blood trickled from his split lip where it had hit the brick. "I said get up." Harold was up, swaying slightly but standing. Tank grabbed the front of his jacket and pulled him close. "You think you're tough, old man? Think that army jacket makes you special?" Harold said nothing. Tank shoved him again, harder this time. Harold's head snapped back against the brick. Stars exploded behind his eyes, but he remained standing. The crowd had grown to 30 people now. They watched in fascination and horror as a man 3 times Harold's size brutalized someone old enough to be his grandfather. But nobody intervened. Nobody called the police. They just watched and recorded and whispered among themselves. Tank raised his fist for another blow. "That's enough, Tank." Bobby's voice cut through the tension. "He's had enough." Tank turned on his second in command. "I decide when he's had enough. Look at him, man. He's bleeding. He's 90 years old. This isn't a fight, it's assault." Tank glanced around at the crowd, suddenly aware of how many phones were pointed at him. The viral video that would make him look like a hero to his crew would make him look like a monster to everyone else. "Get out of here, old man," Tank growled. "Before I change my mind about finishing this." Harold pushed himself away from the wall. His legs shook, but they held. He picked up his book from where it had fallen in the gutter and tucked it under his arm. "I'm sorry about your motorcycle," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. Then he turned and walked away, each step measured and deliberate despite the pain radiating through his chest and back. The crowd parted silently to let him pass. Behind him, Tank's laughter echoed off the brick buildings. "That's what I thought. Keep walking, Grandpa." Harold didn't look back. He walked the 4 blocks home with his head up and his shoulders as straight as arthritis would allow, blood drying on his lip, wondering if this was how his story would end, as entertainment for strangers with smartphones. Harold's hands shook as he tried to unlock his front door. The key missed the lock twice before he managed to slide it home. Inside, he went straight to the bathroom and examined his face in the mirror. His lower lip was split and swollen. A bruise was already forming along his left cheekbone where his head had hit the brick. His ribs ached with every breath. Not broken, he didn't think, but definitely bruised. At 92, bruises took months to heal, and bones— well, bones never healed quite right anymore. Harold ran cold water over a washcloth and pressed it to his lip. The face in the mirror looked back at him. Not the young soldier who'd crawled through Korean snow, not the man who'd raised a daughter after his wife died, but an old man who'd been beaten by a stranger while a crowd watched and did nothing. He'd spent 70 years believing that service meant something. That sacrifice earned respect. That wearing the uniform, Even a faded field jacket commanded a certain dignity. Today had taught him otherwise. Harold lowered himself into his recliner, every muscle protesting. The house felt smaller somehow, the silence deeper. Margaret's photograph smiled at him from the mantel. The same smile that had welcomed him home from Korea, that had given him strength through 2 decades of raising Sarah alone after the cancer took her. What would Margaret think if she'd seen him today? Her husband, pushed around by a thug while people recorded it for their amusement? Harold closed his eyes and tried to push the shame away. He'd done nothing wrong. Walking down a public street wasn't a crime. Accidentally touching someone's motorcycle wasn't grounds for assault. He'd apologized. He'd tried to de-escalate. He'd shown restraint when every instinct screamed at him to fight back. But restraint felt like cowardice now. All those years of teaching Sarah to stand up for herself, to never let anyone push her around, to meet aggression with strength, and when the moment came, he'd just stood there and taken it. The phone rang. Harold considered not answering. He wasn't ready to talk to anyone, wasn't ready to explain what had happened. But it might be Sarah, and he couldn't ignore his daughter. "Hello, Dad. You sound strange. Are you okay?" Sarah's voice carried that special quality military officers developed, the ability to cut through nonsense and identify problems quickly. Harold had heard the same tone in his own voice when he'd been a sergeant in Korea. "I'm fine, sweetheart." "No, you're not. What happened?" Harold hesitated. Pride warred with practicality, dignity with need. He'd spent 30 years after Margaret's death proving he could take care of himself, that he didn't need help from anyone. But the pain in his ribs was getting worse, and the shame was worse than the pain. "Dad, I had a situation. Downtown. Outside Murphy's bar." Silence on the other end. Then, "Are you hurt?" "Bruised ribs. Split lip. Nothing serious." "Was it those bikers?" "I've heard about them from Sheriff Martinez." "Dad, did someone hurt you?" Harold found himself telling her everything. The accidental contact with the motorcycle, Tank's demands, the crowd watching and doing nothing, the humiliation of being shoved around while people recorded it. When he finished, the silence stretched for nearly a minute. "Dad," Sarah said finally, her voice carrying the kind of cold authority that made colonels nervous, "I need you to listen to me very carefully." "Sarah, go to Murphy's bar. Right now. I don't care if you don't want to, I don't care if you're tired. I need you visible. I need you where people can see you." "Sweetheart, I don't think." "Dad." The word carried the weight of command. "This is not a request. Go to Murphy's bar. Sit somewhere public. Order a Coke if you have to, but be visible. Do you understand?" Something in her tone made Harold's spine straighten. This wasn't his daughter talking anymore. This was Colonel Stewart, the woman who commanded 200 soldiers and million-dollar aircraft. "How long do I need to stay?" 20 minutes. Maybe less. Harold struggled to his feet, his ribs screaming in protest. "Sarah, what are you?" 20 minutes, Dad. I'm already in the air." The line went dead. Harold stared at the phone for a long moment, then slowly put it back in its cradle. In the air. Sarah was stationed at Fort Campbell, nearly 300 miles away. What did she mean she was already in the air? He looked at his reflection in the hallway mirror. The bruise was darker now, the split lip more pronounced. He looked like exactly what he was, an old man who'd been beaten up by someone half his age. But if Sarah said go to Murphy's bar, he'd go to Murphy's bar. She was his daughter, but she was also a colonel in the United States Army. When she gave an order, people followed it, even if they didn't understand why. Harold grabbed his wallet and keys, locked the front door behind him, and began the slow walk back to Main Street. His ribs protested with every step, but he kept moving. 20 minutes, she'd said. He could manage 20 minutes. Whatever was coming. His daughter was in the air. Tank Morrison was holding court at Murphy's bar, regaling his crew with an increasingly embellished version of his encounter with the old man. With each telling, Harold became more aggressive, more threatening, more deserving of the beating he'd received. "Grabbed my bike like he owned it," Tank was saying, his fourth beer making the story more heroic. Started mouthing off about how bikers were scum, how his generation was better than ours. Had to teach him some respect. Bobby nursed his whiskey and said nothing. He'd been there. He'd seen what really happened. An old man had accidentally touched a motorcycle and apologized immediately. But Tank's version was already becoming gospel among the crew. Outside, Harold sat on a bench across the street, exactly where Sarah had told him to be. Visible. Public. The bruise on his face was impossible to miss, and several passers-by had recognized him from the earlier incident. Word was spreading through Millbrook's small community. The old veteran was back, sitting alone, looking like he'd been through hell. Mrs. Patterson walked her beagle past the bench and stopped. "Harold. My goodness, what happened to your face?" "I'm fine, Mrs. Patterson. Just waiting for someone." She looked toward Murphy's bar, where Tank's motorcycle gleamed under the streetlights. Her expression hardened. "That animal did this to you, didn't he?" Harold didn't answer, but his silence was confirmation enough. "Somebody ought to call the police," Mrs. Patterson muttered. But they both knew Millbrook's police force consisted of 3 officers who generally avoided Murphy's bar unless absolutely necessary. More people began to notice Harold sitting alone on the bench. Rita closed her diner early and walked over, her face tight with anger when she saw his injuries. "Harold Stewart, who did this to you?" "It's handled, Rita." "Thank you." "It's not handled. Look at your face. You need to go to the hospital, need to." "It's handled," Harold repeated, his tone carrying enough authority to stop her protests. Inside Murphy's bar, Tank was warming to his story. Size of a linebacker, this old bastard was. Started swinging before I knew what hit me. Lucky I didn't put him in the hospital. That's when they heard it. Thump, thump, thump. The rhythmic beating of helicopter rotors, growing louder by the second. Conversations died as people turned toward the sound. Through the bar's grimy windows, they could see something moving across the darkening sky. "What the hell?" Diesel muttered, stepping outside. The helicopter was massive, military green with numbers stenciled on its side. A UH-60 Black Hawk, the workhorse of the U.S. Army, designed to carry soldiers into combat zones. It circled the town once, low enough that its rotor wash sent trash skittering down Main Street. Tank emerged from the bar, beer in hand, squinting up at the aircraft. "Why's there a military chopper over Millbrook?" The Black Hawk banked sharply and began to descend, its landing lights blazing like white suns. The rotor wash intensified, whipping dust and debris in all directions. Car alarms began to wail. Dogs barked. People emerged from businesses and homes, drawn by the sound and spectacle. The helicopter settled onto the empty lot next to Murphy's bar, its rotors slowly winding down. Through the pilot's window, they could see figures in military uniforms, faces hidden behind dark visors. A crowd was gathering now. 50 people, then 100. Cell phones appeared, recording everything. Whatever was happening, it was the biggest thing to hit Millbrook in decades. The Black Hawk's door slid open. 6 soldiers emerged, dressed in full combat gear, body armor, helmets, weapons at the ready. They moved with the precision of a special operations team, forming a perimeter around the aircraft. None of them spoke. They simply stood and waited. A 7th figure appeared in the helicopter's doorway, an officer in dress uniform, silver eagles gleaming on her collar. She jumped down from the aircraft and strode toward Murphy's bar, her bearing unmistakably military, her purpose clear. Tank took an involuntary step backward. "What the hell is this?" The officer ignored him and the growing crowd. She walked directly to the bench where Harold sat waiting, her expression unreadable behind dark sunglasses. "Dad." Harold looked up at his daughter, Colonel Sarah Stewart, commander of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment's Alpha Company. In her dress blues, with her silver eagles and combat ribbons, she looked every inch the warrior she'd become. "Hello, sweetheart." Sarah knelt beside the bench, her trained eye taking in Harold's injuries. The split lip, the developing bruise, the way he held himself protectively around his ribs. Her jaw tightened, but her voice remained calm. "Are you hurt anywhere else?" "Just what you can see." Sarah stood and turned toward Murphy's bar, where Tank and his crew were clustered near the entrance, their earlier bravado replaced by confusion and growing concern. "Which one?" she asked quietly. Harold nodded toward Tank, who stood frozen like a deer in headlights. "The big one." Sarah walked across the street, her combat boots clicking on the asphalt. The crowd parted before her like water. She stopped directly in front of Tank, close enough that he could see his reflection in her sunglasses. "Are you the individual who assaulted my father?" Tank's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Your father?" "Harold Stewart. 92 years old. Korean War veteran. 3 Bronze Stars. My father." Each word was delivered with the precision of a rifle shot. "Did you put your hands on him?" The crowd had grown silent, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Tank looked around desperately, but found no support among his crew. Even Bobby had stepped away, leaving him alone to face this uniformed apparition. There was a misunderstanding." "Did you put your hands on him?" Sarah repeated. Tank's shoulders sagged. All the bluster, all the tough guy posturing, evaporated under the colonel's steady gaze. Yeah, I did." Sarah nodded once, as if confirming intelligence she'd already received. She turned to address the crowd, her voice carrying clearly across the silent street. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Colonel Sarah Stewart, United States Army. The man sitting on that bench is my father, Staff Sergeant Harold Stewart, retired. He served 2 tours in Korea, earned 3 Bronze Stars for valor, and spent 40 years working as a machinist before retiring to this community." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Today, he was assaulted by a civilian while walking down a public street. None of you intervened. None of you called for help. You stood by and watched while a war hero was beaten by a coward." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Phones were still recording, but now the viewers seemed less entertained than ashamed. Sarah turned back to Tank. "You have 2 choices. You can come with us voluntarily, or my team can make you come. Either way, you're going to answer for what you did." Tank looked at the soldiers surrounding the helicopter, their weapons and gear, their obvious readiness for violence. "Come with you where?" "That depends on you. Cooperate, and you'll be turned over to local authorities. Resist, and we'll discuss federal charges related to assaulting a veteran." Tank's face went pale. Federal charges? The Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act covers attacks on individuals based on their status as veterans, Sarah said matter-of-factly. Assault of a 92-year-old man in front of witnesses, recorded on multiple devices? That's a slam-dunk conviction. Tank looked desperately at his crew, but they were all studying their boots. Bobby stepped forward. "Tank, just go with them. You screwed up. Take your medicine." Tank's shoulders sagged in defeat. "Do I need a lawyer?" "That's up to you," Sarah said. "But right now, you need to walk over to that helicopter and keep your hands where my soldiers can see them." Tank nodded slowly and began walking toward the Black Hawk, his boots dragging on the asphalt. 2 soldiers flanked him immediately, professional but not rough. They helped him into the aircraft's cargo bay and secured him with restraints. Sarah watched until the procedure was complete, then walked back to her father. "Ready to go home, Dad?" Harold struggled to his feet, accepting Sarah's arm for support. "What about my car?" "Rita's going to drive it to your house," Sarah said. "I already asked her." They walked together toward the helicopter, Harold moving slowly but steadily. The crowd watched in silence as the old veteran climbed into the aircraft that had come to collect him, helped by his daughter who had moved heaven and earth to right a wrong. The Black Hawk's engine spun up with a rising whine. The rotors began to turn, slowly at first, then faster. Dust and debris swirled through the crowd as the aircraft lifted off, climbing into the darkening sky. As the sound of the rotors faded, the crowd began to disperse. But conversations had already started. Whispered discussions about what they'd witnessed, about the old man they'd ignored, about the daughter who'd commanded the sky to defend her father's honor. Mrs. Patterson was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. Who was that old man, anyway? Rita, still shaken by what she'd witnessed, answered without hesitation. That was Harold Stewart. He earned 3 Bronze Stars fighting in Korea before most of us were born. And he raised the woman who just shut down Main Street from the sky. The crowd looked up at the empty sky where the Black Hawk had disappeared, carrying a veteran home and a message that would echo through Millbrook for years to come. Some things are still sacred, and some people are still willing to fight for them.